here goes. All righty. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. So happy with the program tonight. I'm joined by a sci-fi fantasy author, Berneta L. Haynes, who's also an anti-imperialist thinker, a social racial justice advocate, and queer liberationist. And on the program, we're going to discuss the B in LGBTQ plus rights, and that's bisexuality, and the issues facing bisexual men, women, and bisexual men, women, and non-binary. So let's get into it. But first off, Berneta, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me here.
It's an honor to have you here, and really can't wait to talk to you about this very criminally overlooked issue, which is biphobia. I'm also looking forward to talking to you about your books, because I mostly only read nonfiction. So, but this conversation is going to change all that, because I'm going to make sure to get all of your books. I'm going to even take like a year off to like not read any more like nonfiction to get your books, Laura Bates's new fictional books. So anywho, thank you for joining me. And so the first question I wanted to ask you is what are the current state of affairs for the bisexual community? Because there's been great advances, small advances, but big advances for gays and lesbians in part of the West when it comes to marriage equality, and a bit of a far greater level of tolerance depending on which state you're in the US. And though our trans brothers and sisters are facing a fierce backlash for asserting their rights to stop being marginalized and excluded in the LGBT rights, we often forget the B in LGBT or queer community. So talk to us about that and biphobia.
Yeah, I like to think that we're always just kind of there, sort of like around in the background, just kind of always there, but never really super on the radar for the most part. And in a lot of ways, that's good and bad. And I've seen in a lot of ways that bisexuals are just kind of not discussed or talked about. Mm-hmm. And it's harmful, but in some ways it's almost a relief when we see how overly exposed our trans brothers and sisters are. It's almost a bit of a relief, but at the same time, that level of invisibility has a lot of damage that it does to your psyche. There's always, I think, a certain kind of, am I really queer kind of attitude that you have. But I have also, there's something about being on Twitter that has really opened my eyes to how much folks are very different in the way that they think now about bisexuality. I remember when, I'm 37, so I remember when I first came out back in 2005. Yes, 2005.
Oh, and, wow, that was during the dark ages of the Bush administration, right?
Yeah, right. The dark ages, indeed. And I had a funny coming out, because I came out to my mom as bisexual, but at the time I thought I was a lesbian. It's the common bisexual story, right?
Yeah.
But I thought I'd soften the blow just by coming out as bisexual. And I have a very boring story, because my mom was just kind of like, oh, so when did you know? And oh, well, tell me more. And she just got really scientific at the, in the whole discussion. And she was completely just more mystified and interested than anything else.
That is interesting.
Yeah, and I share that because when I told that story to people when I did come out back then, I often got a response that was like, wow, it's nice to have a boring coming out story, huh? But nowadays I see younger folks coming out, and many of them have boring coming out stories as bisexual. They're just kind of like, oh yeah. And I think that's really an improvement over the time that, the dark ages, so to speak, of 2005 and the Bush era and previously. So I try not to think too negatively about where we are right now in terms of bisexual liberation and visibility, because we are so far away from where we were. And there's so much going on with our trans brothers and sisters, and even members of the gay community in general, that it almost feels like I'm not going to take up space too much as a bisexual. But that said, you cannot get away from the sort of erasure that is just always common. The comments that people make, well, he came out as bi, he's on his way to being gay. He's just not bold enough to say he's gay. Or she came out as bi, but she's married to a man. So, come on, she's just trying to be hip. So you can't ever get away from that, no matter how far we progress. And I think it causes more harm than folks will ever understand if they're not bisexual. Yeah.
Yeah, and what are some of the issues that are and what are some of the issues, like some of the mental health issues that plays out in in bisexual folk? Because I remember when I was reaching out to you, you gave me some pretty depressing statistics of of the impacts that institutional biphobia has on has on our bisexual brothers and sisters. So talk about that.
Yeah, the stats on like bisexuals in terms of suicide rates, depression, and other types of mental health disorders, substance abuse or substance use disorders are very stark. And they're very similar to the same stats that we see for our trans brothers and sisters. And I think that it's not surprising to me that the T and the B in our community are suffering greater issues around mental health and all that, because these are the two groups that are the most heavily stigmatized in some way, and one way invisible and the other way overly visible. But this sort of feeling of not really having a place that comes from both ends, it comes from heterosexuals as well as gay folks, that you're just not there, you're not in any community, is extremely alienating. And I just wish I had some stats on how bisexual folks and people who are openly bisexual are starting to figure out how to navigate these lines that they walk in between both worlds. Because every time I try to convey to someone that you never really have a place where you fit in either community, they're like, well, what does that mean? And I always give the example of, well, let's say I have friends who are straight, and they come over and I'm watching the L Word or something like that. One of the first things I'm going to hear from that straight friend, more than likely, is, whoa, this is very graphic. Even though if I was watching a movie with heterosexual romance in it, that comment would never come up, right?
Exactly.
Right? And that's happened to me, actually. But if I'm around queer friends and I'm watching something straight or something that's featuring heterosexual relationships or something like that, then the response is, oh, why are we watching this? Right? And again, that's happened to me. I don't usually let it bother me too much because I just kind of roll with the punches. But at some point, you have to recognize that really does indicate that as a bisexual, you don't really have a community in either of these two communities. I think it's really a matter of us creating our own community as bisexuals in order to overcome this, quite honestly. I feel like I haven't really seen that happen. Although let me speak to pansexuality, which I think I always have a lot of feelings about that term, because
actually funny. I was definitely going to ask you that question, but we'll save that one for later though.
Well, I was only going to say it because I feel like they have actually done a lot to create a pansexual community in a way that bisexuals haven't. But they're all the same, the two. But anyway, it's very fascinating.
Well, actually, but before I ask why, why the bisexual community has not asserted their identity more, let's, let me ask you then, the perfect segue to this question, which is talk to us about the biphobia that's coming from none other than the queer community itself, from gays and lesbians, because I find that as shocking, and blood boiling, and also mind baffling as colorism or transphobia within the queer community. So talk to us about, biphobia being engaged by, by gays and lesbians, and how that ironically only strengthens heteronormativity.
Yeah, and even sometimes engaged in by bisexuals themselves. So
okay.
Yeah, but so when I was, I'm married now, and but when I was out there dating, and I pity anyone who's out there on those streets dating right now, because good luck, good luck. But it was so unbelievably challenging to date lesbians, quite honestly. And it was not necessarily because of them necessarily, thinking of bisexuals as less than. That was sometimes. It just, you wouldn't be recognized as queer. Like there was a way that the community would kind of expect you to carry yourself or something.
Yeah.
And if you just happen to be a little bit less obvious in your bisexuality, whatever that means, the possibility of even being talked to or chatted up was just extremely limited. So you had to be the person to really go out there and do it. And even if you were in a situation where finally you were able to chat up myself, like chat up a woman who only dates women, as soon as it comes to the discussion about you being bisexual and dating men, still, it's fine if you dated men before, but you still date men. It's like, well, how serious are you then about a relationship with a woman? And my response was always, what part of bisexual didn't sink in though? Like relationships with women and relationships with men and relationships with non-binary people and so forth. Like what part of that didn't sink in? But I always felt like I had some sort of empathy in a lot of ways for lesbians that I encountered who did have that kind of response, like, how serious are you? I don't know if I want to take that chance because you may not be serious. I feel like I understood in a lot of ways where they were coming from. There is such an incentive in our very heterosexist society to have a heterosexual relationship that you would wonder if there is going to be pressure on this bisexual partner of yours to just cave in and have the easier life of a heterosexual relationship. I think I honestly saw it as a very legitimate concern. My problem was always when they would not necessarily hear from that bisexual person that, no, I'm very serious and I'm very interested in you and I'm not faking it. I'm not just using you on my way to finding a man. Like it's actually real. The unwillingness to listen sometimes is what always really bothers me. But the initial instinct to be like, I don't know if I trust that this person's really serious about having a same-sex relationship, to me, it was understandable. And I still kind of like get where people come from on that. But you have to be willing to listen and learn and grow and realize that maybe your instincts are not entirely right and that they're doing damage to a person psychologically by erasing them. Now, what I do have a problem with, and what has always bothered me, is the biphobia that shows up towards bisexual men in particular, that says, from bisexual women who are like, oh no, I can't date a man who's been with men. And I have come across bisexual women who have said that. And
unbelievable.
And it's appalling to me. It's because it's the internalized belief that, oh, he's really just gay. That men in particular can't even possibly be bisexual. Maybe women can, or maybe the woman's just confused, but maybe women can. But men, they're just gay and they're on their way to being gay, but they're not courageous enough to say it. That's the attitude. And it's very internalized among women from various backgrounds, whether they're heterosexual women or bisexual women. And it just irks me. It irks me so much. I cannot comment on what kind of experiences bisexual men end up encountering with gay men that they try to pursue or date, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's similar to what bisexual women encounter with lesbians, where it's going to be hit or miss, and you're going to find some people who are open-minded, but you're probably going to find a lot of people who are not, and they're just not going to take you seriously. The last thing I'll say on it in terms of biphobia and how it plays out, besides erasing bisexual men entirely, besides playing down bisexual women as if we're just kind of on our, we're kind of fickle. The other way it plays out is in this sort of, look at how privileged you are. Like, you can't really understand the struggle, the queer struggle, because you can easily go through the world in a straight relationship and no one would think anything else of it until you announce it. That is, to me, that's a really interesting argument that I've heard from folks, because I can't really be in a straight relationship. And I explain what I mean by that. There's no way that I could have gotten into this relationship with my now partner, my now husband, and just behave like every other heterosexual woman. Like, it just was not going to happen. I'm always going to have a crowd of queer friends, period. I'm always going to be the woman who's like literally talking to you about, oh yeah, she looks good, huh? That kind of thing. I'm always going to be a straight woman isn't doing that. I'm always going to be the woman watching all kinds of queer shit, like every kind of queer and gay and lesbian show I could find, I'm going to watch. Like many, I'll go ahead and say it, but like many queer women, apparently, I prefer porn that is not lesbian porn because it's too fake. So for me, like, but I like gay male porn. You know.
Okay.
So that's not a straight woman thing. This is not a straight woman thing. I don't watch any of it anymore because it's all boring. I don't understand how anybody even watches it. It's so boring. Anyway, bless the sex workers. Bless the sex workers. They have to make a living, but I'm so bored. I was like, this is so boring. But there are just some things that about me that are just so inherently not straight that there's no way that any relationship I was going to be in was going to be a straight relationship, you know? Because of me, my partner and I completely binged since 8. He's obsessed with it. He's been obsessed with it. We completely binged all of the L Word, including the reboot. We've binged Pose multiple times. He's obsessed with Electra. All of them, really. The man was basically almost in tears as we sat down watching the first 2 episodes of Pose years ago. So all these things that straight friends of mine, like when I mention it to them, they're like, oh yeah, I haven't gotten around to watching that. Or it's, oh yeah, that's really graphic. I can't watch that regarding the L Word or something. I forced him to watch Noah's Ark, which he was like, this is the corniest show I have ever seen in my life. I was like, I know.
Yeah, you have to tell me about that one later.
Yeah. So, but there's just cultural things, like there are cultural events we're going to go to that, you know, they're part of me because I'm queer. The way that I write and the things I'm going to write about, I don't write straight characters really, not as my main characters. And now my partner who co-writes with me, he's written, we're both writing not straight characters, queer characters of some form. So it's very interesting to see how bio erasure happens and the way, how inaccurate people's perceptions of bisexuality really is. But at the same time, I always weigh it compared to the other types of harms that other members of the queer community face. And I try to keep a certain kind of humility about, what we experience as bisexuals compared to other members of the community.
Now, before we get to the bi erasure movement, what do you say to some of the people who say, like, I knew somebody who came out as bi, but then later they went full, gay or lesbian, or the person or the odd person here and there who maybe was confused about their sexuality and then later identified with whatever straight, G or L. I mean, what do you say to people like that that see bisexuality, is a phase, or whatever the stupid argument is?
As a pit stop, essentially. Some people really see it as a pit stop on one way to either to just heterosexuality and sticking with it, or to homosexuality and sticking with it. Yeah. Really, it's as a pit stop. I always say to people like that, well, how does that person still identify to this day? Even if they're in a same-sex relationship, have you asked them how do they currently identify? Do they currently identify as a lesbian or a gay man, or are they still identifying as bisexual? Do they identify as a heterosexual woman or man, or are they still identifying as bisexual? I fully believe in going by the labels that people tell me they prefer. And I think what's helped me understand this and what's helped me sort of, I think, empathize with some of these folks who do engage in this kind of bio erasure is my own come to Jesus moment, so to speak, with trans issues. Like many people, I spent a long time being like, I just don't understand. Like, how are we supposed to, like, what does it doesn't make sense to me. I spent a long time feeling that way. And like trans women are women, but they're not women. Like I had that stupid idea in my head for a long time.
Oh, the whole TERF
And
thing, the whole trans exclusionary feminist thing, right? Or
yeah. And for a long time, and, throughout my 20s. And then I hit my 30s and I was like, wait a minute. First of all, what do I know? Because I would hope people get older and wiser and realize there's so much they don't actually know. So I said, what do I know? I'm not trans. I just happen to luck up and be born with a vagina and identify with the genital part that society has said is woman, right? So what do I know? And the older I got, the more I just kind of like learned to sit back and listen. And I told myself, I was like, okay, how does this person identify? The only thing that's important here to me right now and should be important to me is how does this person identify? Not what I think they are or what I think they look like, but how did I identify? Did I identify as woman, as non-binary, as man? And that's what I'm going with. And I say the same thing is true for folks who see a bisexual person or a person who came out as bisexual and years later they end up in a same-sex relationship or a heterosexual relationship. Don't make any judgment. Ask them, how did I identify? And at times you may come across a person who was bisexual at one point who now is in a same-sex relationship and they identify as gay or lesbian. That may literally just be who they are. They may have felt pressured into identifying one way or the other.
yeah.
But at the end of the day, if that's how they say they identify, that is how they identify. And that's the only thing that matters. I really think it's just that simple.
So is it safe to say that there's probably a lot of that there probably is a lot of bisexual people around, but they're simply in the closet because they don't want to deal with the marginalization that they'll face from all members of the community, whether it's straights, the same sex community,
Mhm.
that they just don't want to face that, but there probably is, like, many who do sometimes question their sexuality by saying, I do feel very much attracted to women, but I simply prefer out of convenience to just
Yeah,
go for to just go for the guys or go for the girls or just be in the
yeah.
same sex thing because, yeah, for whatever reason. Like, is there a lot of that
Yeah.
happening then? So a lot of
I
closet bisexual folk.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. We are a society that doesn't like an in the middle. We don't like in the middle things, whether it's race, gender, or sexuality. It's just way easier to identify in one of the binaries. It always is. That's why you have so many biracial people who will just identify with one race. And you're kind of looking at them like, but you're biracial, but they're like, no, I'm black. And you're like, okay, whatever you call yourself is what I'll call you.
Yeah.
But so I think there are probably a lot of people, a lot of bisexuals like that, who just kind of, it's just easier. It's easier to have a cohesive network and community if they're part of this particular accepted, branded community, versus, this nebulous one that no one really still understands or really values or truly accepts. I think the folks who really, I think people who really sort of cling to that middle identity are definitely taking a risk that
Mhm.
folks who don't cling to it are not taking. That's for sure. But I feel like, whatever gives you some peace is, to me, what you should do. So if you know you're a bisexual person, but you're in this relationship and you're married to a woman and you're a woman, and for all intents and purposes, your entire community of friends and family and whatnot are all lesbians, then, there's not really all that much of an incentive to keep being like, I'm bisexual. It's like people in your community probably already know. So I don't know necessarily what else it gains you to constantly say it. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Um, so there's also that. But at the same time, I think that the more we can claim it, the more it gives younger folks who are trying to figure out who they are, more it gives them sort of something that they can, sort of grab onto and a sense of what's possible. So I don't like the idea that some people kind of get in one community and they just go with that label, because it does make it seem like we're lower, we're smaller in number than we probably are. But I also know that you have to protect your mental health the only way you know how. So
Exactly.
you
And
know?
that's a perfect segue then to what you alluded to, which is bi erasure. And so let's talk about the bi erasure movement. So explain what bi erasure means, that biphobic movement, and how institutional heteronormativity and biphobes in the queer community have sadly advanced this regressive agenda.
Yeah, I mean, bi erasure is exactly, what it sounds like. It's essentially this this rhetoric of essentially treating bisexuals as though they just don't exist. It's a way of ignoring, removing, and sort of re-explaining bisexuality. Like, oh, as we mentioned, oh, well, they're just on their path to this thing or that thing.
Yeah.
It occurs in a lot of different facets, not just in the queer community generally, but in history, in academia. We see it in news media. We see it in shows. I mean, the L word in particular the initial L word, the original one, was a great example of bi erasure, with the character of what's her name, the one who's always starting all the gossip, the blonde.
I actually never saw the L word,
but she started out as a bisexual character, and she was dating men. And she's so annoying too on this show. I can't remember her name. But she started out as a bisexual character, and she was dating men and women. And slowly but surely, Alice, there we go. And slowly but surely, her character is just lesbian, right? And she's only dating women. And all the time, throughout the time when she's dating men, the other lesbian characters make little remarks about her dating men and like, oh, why are you even bothering? That kind of thing. You don't like them that much anyway. This sort of weird perception that bisexual means I like men and women equally, which is just not really true.
Yeah.
But what I do appreciate about the reboot is that they've essentially addressed the bi erasure, because in the reboot, Alice is very much dating a man again, and now she's actually said to her friends, I hate that I have to re-announce all over again that I'm bisexual, because you lesbians just couldn't get it in your minds that I'm bisexual. I was only with women for a while.
Yeah.
So I mean, for all its flaws, the reboot is definitely trying to address some of the bi erasure, but we see it so often. I mean, I think that it's overly common in movies. I think in books, whenever I've looked for queer literature, it's so often just, folks who are, lesbian or gay. I hardly ever see queer literature that focuses on trans people or bisexuals. And even if a character starts out that way, they kind of are just lesbian by the end, or just gay by the end. So that's kind of what bi erasure really boils down to. It's just this tendency to ignore, remove, or re-explain, any sort of indications of bisexuality. It's like, oh, they're on their way to this. And it's been a long-standing problem that I think if we were able to tackle it, we would do ourselves a lot of justice in terms of dismantling some of the heterosexism, in fact, that we see. Because heterosexism and heteronormative society says you have to be one way or the other, right? That's really, it's a very binary culture. And I think being able to dismantle some of this bi erasure would get us a long way towards dismantling heterosexism and heteronormativity. But I don't think too many members of the queer community maybe see it that way.
Is it safe to say, sadly, that the bi erasure movement has been very successful?
I don't think it has been, actually. I think maybe for a time. I think maybe in the dark ages of the Bush era, it was successful. But I don't think it has been. I think about some of the celebrities that have recently come out as bisexual, and especially among some of the younger celebrities, like the lady from Twilight and a couple of other folks that I'm thinking of right off the top of my head. Janelle Monáe, who actually came out as pansexual, but you get the gist.
Well, yeah, we're gonna get into that.
We'll get to it. But
Halsey isn't Halsey like a very proud bisexual person.
And even when Frank Ocean came out, he didn't come out, from my recollection, as a gay man. He came out as bisexual, essentially. He got erased as just being gay, unfortunately. But from my recollection, he came out as essentially a bi man. I think it's interesting that even Lil Nas X, who for all intents and purposes, I believe has just said specifically he's a gay man. A lot of the lyrics of his songs though, are he talks about both genders or two genders very often in his song lyrics. So even if he himself is a gay man, his song lyrics are very openly kind of like bisexual, and very often, more often than not, which I think is nice and inclusive of him to actually have lyrics like that. So I don't think they've done a fantastic job of erasing bisexuals very much at all.
Well, that's very good to hear then.
Yeah, I think we just don't.
But there still is an invisibility problem. There still is an invisibility problem, and that is, of course, linked to biphobia, both within the queer community and straight supremacy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's linked to every one of those things. And for that reason, I think it'll probably always be a problem until we tackle each of those issues. We're going to always kind of be running uphill and trying to make sure we don't become totally invisible, right? But the way that sexism kind of sort of plays in our favor as bisexual women, I think has helped prevent the total erasure of bisexual people. Because bisexual women are very much allowed to be that way. In the wider, broader heterosexual society, even if we're kind of, played down like, oh, they're not really, whatever, but we're allowed to say it and not lose our entire career, if we're in Hollywood, for instance. And even if we're not in Hollywood, if we're in a regular old job, we're allowed to say it and not lose our entire livelihood. For men, it's just that's not the case. There's so much more on the line for men coming out that way. And unfortunately, I think it's why so many male celebrities probably never come out really as bisexual or gay. But
unbelievable. And that's a perfect segue then to this question, which is can you talk about how bisexuality as an identity is being consciously removed as an identity, replaced in favor of new distorted terms like yours truly, pansexuality, and so forth?
Yeah, pansexuality is just such an interesting term. When I first heard it, I felt like an old person almost immediately. It was 2013. Yeah, it was 2013. No, sorry. Yeah, it was the end of 2013. And I know that because I was in Chicago and I tried online dating essentially for the first time in Chicago. And eventually, a month later, after I first tried it, I met my now husband. But I went on this date.
Oh, yeah, fantastic! That's a very good endorsement for online dating. I'm gonna keep that in mind. Then send me the website afterwards.
Mm-hmm. But one of the first dates I went on was with this guy who he was like very like entrenched in like the West Side Mexican community and so forth, which I was like fascinated with and trying to learn more about, because I don't know if you know about Chicago, but Pilsen is an amazing area. The murals and things like this, all the Mexican American history over there. But he was gung-ho about telling me all about his Mexicanness and then how he was interested in like learning to be a cop, becoming a cop, which I was like, pump the brakes, I don't know about that. The thing that fascinated me the most was like, he was like, oh, and as a pansexual. And I was like, hold up. What do you mean by pansexual? I don't get what this, because I was like, I'm not interested in some weird, like, what are you talking about? And then he explained, he's like, oh, it means gender doesn't matter to me in terms of who I'm interested in dating. And I was like, oh, so like bisexual? Well, no, because it recognizes there are more than two genders. And I was like, but bisexuality, despite the term, recognizes that too. Have you read the Bisexual Manifesto? And so we had this, and he was like, Bisexual Manifesto. He was a little younger than me, so I put it to that. Anyway.
No, but pansexuality, that is bisexuality. Like, if you're attracted to somebody who identifies as a woman and is transitioning, you're attracted to that person's like gender identity, whether it's whether it's man or woman. Now, the whole non-binary thing, which I'm still learning about, which I definitely need to have you back on the program to discuss, to discuss all that. But putting that aside, but the pansexuality, I mean, that is bisexuality.
I honestly feel like it almost has a way of weirdly othering trans people, because at the end of the day, if we are all accepting of trans people as the gender that they identify as man or woman, right? Yeah. And putting non-binary aside for now. But if we fully believe in our hearts that trans women are women and that trans men are men, then how is bisexuality a problematic term? Do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
Why do you need to create an entirely new term just to make sure that you're including trans people? It's very offensive to me, to trans people, but I'm not trans, so I won't even say that, speak on that with authority. But it seems like it's a term that others them in a strange way. And the crazy thing is that it's just duplicative. Like, if you actually do know about the history of bisexuality, it's all in there in the meaning of bisexuality that we all people agreed upon at one point in time, which is that gender is not a factor in who you're attracted to, really. And of course, you may be attracted to one gender more than the other, but it's not going to be the determinative factor. So what else needs to be said? So pansexuality just feels really like, I just put it to the fact that I'm not a Zoomer. And I said, maybe it's a Zoomer thing more so. I was like, I'm not going to judge. Maybe if I was trans, I would judge. But because I'm not going to. It's not my place to judge. But I never use.
If you could have a conversation with somebody who identifies as pansexual, you mentioned Janelle Monáe. Love Janelle Monáe. I went to concert for her. Brilliant artist. Although, yeah. Anyways, some of our politics we do disagree on, but we're not going to get into that.
Oh yeah. Don't get me started on
but if you could have a chance to talk to somebody like Janelle Monáe or Christine of Christine and the Queens, both who you mentioned identify as as pansexual, and if you could have like a very good honest conversation with them and say, listen, you're bisexual, and there's nothing wrong with being bisexual, but let's get rid of this term pansexuality because you're bisexual and you're only contributing to the Bio Erasure Movement. So how would you approach that conversation with them?
Yeah, that's exactly how I would approach it, though. I mean, I would start out with exactly kind of what I said earlier, which is, do you actually, so you're using pansexuality to indicate that you're not just interested in cis women and cis men, but are you recognizing that in doing so, you're othering trans women and trans men? I would start out with questions. I'm a stickler for just asking people questions to get at what they actually are thinking instead of like trying to judge them. Mm-hmm. So I would ask, like, do you see that as in any way othering trans women and trans men by having to create an entire new term to indicate your attraction includes them, right? But also, if you don't feel that it others them, why do you not feel that it others them? Because I would like to know. I'm actually curious with some of the reasoning that people come up with for why they feel that it's okay and appropriate. I'm willing to be wrong on it, right? But I would also suggest exactly as you said, but you do realize that, there are a large group of people who are bisexual and they have exactly the same sexuality essentially as what you are articulating. And by using this term, you are essentially erasing that group. Like, that's clear, isn't it? Or is it not clear? But I think at the end of the day, if folks want to identify as pansexual, I'm just kind of like, okay, all right, sure. But just do know that there may be people who take your identification as such as kind of an offense. Some of those people being bisexual, some folks who are trans may take it as an offense, and you should be willing to hear maybe why. And I'm sure they'll say the same thing to me as a bisexual. Well, some people will take that as offensive, and you should be willing to hear why. And then we would probably have to leave the conversation.
Well, you could counter that by saying, "Hey, I've taken all the flack of being a bisexual person my entire life."
Right? It's like, long enough time. But yeah, I do what I really appreciate, or what I've seen anyway so far with the pansexual community, Because plenty of trans people too identify as pansexual. So there's a lot of nuance and complexity around the term and whether it's offensive or not. But what I do find interesting about it as a new designation is how I feel like they've actually fostered a community among each other in a way that people who do just identify as bisexual haven't. And I don't really know, I'm curious about the reasoning. I'm curious about why that's the case.
And why do you think that is the case, actually? Because that was one of the questions I was going to. It wasn't one of the questions I had prepared, but as a follow up, why isn't there large bisexual organizations that have names like We Exist, or they open up their own bisexual safe places like bisexual bars or bisexual centers where the community can come together and just have that safe space where they can be free to be themselves, not be marginalized. Yeah, why isn't there why so little of that compared to as you mentioned, the pansexuals who are bi, or the trans community and non-binary folk?
Yeah, I'm curious. I wish I knew the answer. I mean, there are some organizations that are specifically bisexual focused. I mean, there's only like a handful that I can think of, and in the United States, and probably fewer even in the UK.
Yeah.
But I wish I knew why. I guess bisexual folks have always just been so like part of the larger community, even in an ostracized kind of way, that it's just sort of like, there hasn't been a need to like separate it out. Like, I mean, if we actually think about it, P is not part of the, the acronym yet, but B is. So I think there's already like a sense of inclusion, even though we are excluded. So there hasn't been the urge to create a separate community the way the pansexuals have. Does that make sense? Like LGBTQ, if there's no P in it yet. So, we kind of
I usually save myself, the trouble, and of course people will say, "Oh yeah, you would say that because you're a straight cis person," but I usually just say, queer community, queer phobia, and so forth. But
yeah, me too.
Yeah,
I kind of default to queer, although I have to say, I think the straights might be messing up queer for me. I've seen some things recently where I'm like, that word does not mean what you think it means, straight person, and the way that you're using it is extremely like, I just want to be cool. It's just really odd. I just want to be
actually explain that more. Explain that more, because maybe I am guilty of what you're about to describe. So go right ahead.
Yeah. I was thinking about a post from that Terrell guy the other day, and he's not the first person I've seen do it, but he was like, I've started identifying as queer, and this was really more of an intellectual journey for me than anything else. And I was like, but how? But I'm not attracted to men at all. And I was like, okay, so you're a straight man then, who probably is low-key telling us that you're also attracted to trans women, which really wasn't necessary then to announce, because it kind of feels like you're fetishizing them by announcing.
And again, if you're attracted to
women,
a person who identifies as a woman and is in the process of transitioning or has already done it, you're attracted to women. There's nothing.
Yeah. So, but I've seen those kinds of little things happening, and I'm just kind of like, that you're not. So you're just a straight person who somehow is feeling like you're a little different because you happen to be attracted to certain members of the queer community. But that doesn't make you queer. It would be like if my husband was identifying as queer because he's married to a bisexual woman. It would just be very odd. It doesn't make any sense. And I would be looking at him like, okay, really? That's what we're doing today? We need to have a conversation. So it's just, so I've seen, so the word is it's like so many words, it's starting to become muddled, like so many words. And I think it's a little bit, strange to see it become muddled like that, because queer has a history behind it that is I mean, I'm not going to sit here and overly equate something with the N word, but there are some words. I had a friend in grad school, and she explained to me why she would never let a white person use the N word to her, right? And she said, there's never a time really in history where a white person using that word at you, a Black person, didn't precede some violence, right? Similar with the word queer. That word is regularly launched at people from straight folks right before violence is levied against them, like actual physical violence. Similarly for the word bitch coming from men, right? Straight men, but the men generally. Similar to in white people's worlds, the word cunt. It has no effect on me, but nonetheless, it it has a similar. Some words are just, and they're not all equal, right? Because the N word is in its own special category of heinous. But queer is not far off from it. Queer,
yeah. Then then you have words like sluts, bitch, which the moment you say that to a woman, that can definitely like screw up her entire day. It's kind of like it's kind of like the joke that Louis C.K. was was saying when he was talking about racism. He was saying he was talking about like if somebody called me like like a cracker or something, I'm not gonna go, oh my gosh, that has just ruined my entire day.
Because the word doesn't have that history, right? It's all about the history. It's all about the history. The N word has like the bloodiest history ever. Queer and the F bomb and the D word have a similarly bloody history, right? And so some of these words just, to me, I don't know how they can be muddled, right? I just don't know how you can muddle the N word. It's going to mean what it means most of the time, right? And somehow queer though has become this word that it was such an epithet for so long that queer people reclaimed it and said, you know what? No, it was an epithet, but we're going to claim it now as a mantle of pride. And that's not all queer folks, of course. But to see a word that has that kind of bloody history behind it now and just become like this thing that is like, oh, me, straight person, I'm going to use it. It feels so similar to when I see white people call themselves the N word. I'm like, really? You're like,
would you so would you prefer then that's the that straight folk that we don't use the word queer, and that we go back to describing the community, the non-straight community, as LGBT, just like LGBT plus then?
yeah, I think in my mind, the problem I have with it when straight people use it is when they claim it for themselves as if they're queer because they happen to be, I don't know, attracted to someone who's queer. That's the main problem. I just look at them, I'm just kind of very confused by it. But straight people using it to actually talk about all the folks who fall under the LGBTQIA umbrella, I have never felt that was problematic. That said, I have definitely run into some older gay men in particular who do not appreciate it one bit. And for very obvious reasons. There's probably various points in their lives early on where some straight person lobbied that at them and they were like probably fearing for their life in some way. So I'm young enough to not have to have experienced that, and I'm also a woman, so not to have experienced that in the same way. But I think it's queer is in a separate category from the F word or the D word, which should never be used by straight people ever under any circumstances. I think queer has become more of a term that is so used in academia to talk about, and in policy in some ways to talk about this community, that I don't know why it would be problematic for a straight person to use it, as long as they're not using it to identify themselves as queer because they happen to be attracted to a queer person, which is what that Terrell guy was saying. Does that make sense? But I'm only one person who feels that way. And like, I've met plenty of queer people who do not like anybody using it. So, there's always going to be this kind of diversity in the community. It's just like Black folks who do not like anybody using the N word. For instance, anybody, not Black people, white people, anybody.
Yeah.
Especially older Black people generally. And they've been through some things and they've had that word launched at them in very dire moments by white folks. So I don't know. I probably feel like it probably sounds like I'm always sort of like wavering. It's because I've gotten to a point in life where I just feel like there's never really clear-cut answers to anything. So it's hard to say yes, no, never. or yes, 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 always. It's hard to say one way or the other on a lot of things. Yeah.
And going back to bisexuality. What are some of the bisexual positive groups? What are some of the groups that that you mentioned that are that are bisexual pride groups that people should check out in the U.S. because since you're based in the U.S., we'll just talk about the U.S. Yeah, what are some groups that people should check out then? If they do identify as bisexual and they want to they want that safe space.
Yeah, so there's a handful, and unfortunately they're mostly on the coast. But a couple that I know of, and I can't really attest to like how great they are or not, but they definitely exist and they have resources. So I always direct people to them. American Institute of Bisexuality is a weird one. I don't really know what they do, quite honestly, too much, but they, besides research, they do a decent amount of research. So you'll find resources, but I don't know what they do beyond research. But American Institute of Bisexuality, I think they've been around for a long time. They may be one of the older ones. National Bisexual Liberation Group, NBLG.
Okay.
Yeah, that one. New York Bisexual Network. I think it's the New York Bisexual Network. That's one of the older ones too. I think it's been around since the 70s. Let's see. There are a couple more, but I'm like losing. There's one that's called, it's what's it called? Bisexual, Bay Area Bisexual Network. That's what it is, over in the Bay Area, obviously. And those are the ones that come to the top of my mind. And
do you think it's long overdue that that some new organization or just a campaign is launched that says we exist, and if there needs to be like a bisexual club or bisexual community centers, then that does need to be launched.
Yeah, do I feel like there needs to be more done is what you're saying?
More done and more done and like more advocacy, more groups and more and more centers devoted to devoted to the bisexual community.
Yeah, I think so. Just so that young folks are aware that they don't need to try to force themselves into one category or the other if they're not feeling that way. I think the same is, I mean, I feel that way about everything, even when it comes to gender diverse groups. So that it's very important that we have so many non-binary people that are out there too, so that folks who maybe feel like they're not, the gender that they were assigned, still don't necessarily have to always think I have to go all the way one direction to the other side. Like maybe there's a middle that where they fit better. So I definitely think there needs to be more visibility, more during Gay Pride Month. I would love to see more bisexual like awareness events. I think there's no better time to do it. I don't like the idea of having a separate bisexual awareness month.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
At this point, we have like some sort of bisexual awareness day that happens in like September or something like that. And it's just like, why shouldn't it? It should all happen in June. Like it's very important in my mind to keep the community together, because it's, the world is not, it's hostile to all queer people. And segmenting ourselves and, it's not advantageous in the long run. So in my ideal world, if we had more bisexual awareness campaigns during Gay Pride Month, during Queer Pride Month, I would be super ecstatic about it. I think
I would definitely welcome that. I think that should be there. I mean, there's a reason why. It's called the LGBT community, and
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's the fact that we still call it Gay Pride instead of just like a more inclusive term too. But at the same time, I think Gay Pride just became this whole umbrella, and it was like, well, we know everybody's there is not gay per se, but who cares? Because there's always the Dyke March during the Gay Pride Parade. So it's just like there's all this stuff that happens, and I think it's just this umbrella term. It's like, you know what? It's easier to accept. It's the old term we had, but yeah, during Pride Month, the the opportunities that are there are very wide. And the more that I can see literature that focuses on on bisexual characters, I think the better off we are as well. Like I said, I'm not seeing it as much now yet, but I think we're getting there. And I definitely trying to do my part in writing bisexual characters as often as possible. I think I can't actually write a straight character though. Like I can't, I've tried, I'm not good at it. They always kind of come off like not quite as, anyway. I'm not good at it. I wrote a short story recently that centered a male character who is straight. And I just felt the whole time I was writing it, I was like, he should have been gay or at least bi. It's like, I just don't know if I believe him fully. Anyhow, but the more that we can see it in literature, the more we can see it in shows and movies. I loved How to Get Away with Murder, specifically for the fact of Annalisa's unbelievable, wonderful bisexualness that she never, ever, ever downplayed. She never once claimed lesbian. She never once claimed heterosexual. They played up her bisexuality. It was a beautiful thing to see. And Viola Davis just embraced it and ran with it. The more we can see stuff like that, I've seen how Pose has gone such a long way towards making people understand trans people. People in my family who are deeply transphobic and homophobic, like they're just like, oh my God, I fucking love Elektra. We have got to get her in more movies, that kind of stuff. You know, they're just obsessed with that show, watching it like a. I think the more that
I think it also helped, and we talked about this when when we befriended each other. That I think what I personally really liked about Pose, although I still maintain I did not like the last season, but we'll argue about that another time because we already did argue about that on Twitter. But I think what I loved about Pose was the fact that you had so many characters that were Black and that were Black and Latinx, and we watch a lot of movies where our protagonists are white and so forth, white, either white working class or white middle class person that is struggling or just super affluent, so when there is like a person of color, a Black person of character in those kind of roles that's like going through teenage angst or is struggling to find like their place in the world, it simply is like a breath of fresh air, and I really like just like value those those movies, and so
yeah, it really is. And it's amazing how those types of media can really impact folks and open minds. Like, I mean, I think I always underestimated until it happens. I mean, I didn't think Pose would have that kind of impact on anybody, even myself. And it's just, I think it's done so much for visibility and for people being able to empathize and understand. And the more we can get that kind of media across the board, and including bisexual people of color, the better, it's just little things. It's little things, one movie here and there that really centers a bisexual person of color. One movie here and there, one show here and there, the way it can have a ripple effect is just, so I don't think we have to have these huge groundbreaking movements to really sort of like make change. It really is a matter of people in their own individual lives being courageous and willing to say, hey, I'm bisexual, and be proud of it, which can open the minds of everyone that's around them and their family and their friend orbit. It's a matter of a movie here and there, a book here and there that really centers, not just includes, centers a bisexual character of color. And just sort of building blocks like that. I don't always feel that, there's the urgency for a movement all the time. We just need building blocks.
Well, speaking of that, I then have to ask about this. Can you explain to to our audience, some who may not follow queer politics as closely as racial justice issues or anti-imperialism issues, what's this whole "Don't Say Gay" bill that passed in? What's the "Don't Say Gay" bill that passed in Florida? And talk to us about that, and then I have a follow-up question to ask about that.
Yeah, so the "Don't Say Gay" bill in Florida, which apparently Disney helped fund, essentially penalizes teachers for teaching anything that even mentions queer identity, depicts any sort of queer interactions, anything of that nature, to kids who are, I think third grade and lower. I think that's what it is. At one point, they had added to the bill an amendment that would require teachers to out a student to their parents if the teacher determined that that student was not straight. That got struck, like essentially they basically got rid of that amendment before they passed the bill. As far as I know, that's no longer in there. But it's all done under the guise of certain material isn't age appropriate, right? And all this material that is not age appropriate is this, LGBTQ material. And so any teachers who teach any of this kind of material can lose their jobs, their license potentially, I believe. There are other states that are going to follow along with this Florida bill. I think Georgia is already introducing a similar bill. It's very, very problematic. And it's not necessarily on the level of what we're seeing in Texas in terms of the anti-trans bill, which is just, but it's close enough to the point where it's going to really result in students and young folks feeling like they need to be closeted yet again, all over again. And the way it is going to affect all queer people is yet to be seen.
And what would you say to people? And what would you say to people who say that that it is too young to be talking to children, in the third grade about sexuality, not just any kind of, any kind of sexuality? What would you say to people like that who say we can talk to kids about sexuality, but it has to be before they enter middle school or something like that?
Well, I would say, why are you letting them watch anything on TV then? Because anything that they're watching on TV is definitely showing some sort of sexuality, more than likely heterosexuality. Why are they watching any Disney movie? The princess always gets her prince most of the time, except for in Frozen. Isn't that reinforcing heterosexuality? Isn't that teaching them about heterosexuality? So that would be my response to that, because there's no other response necessary. Whatever a kid is being exposed to is exposing them to sexuality, because sexuality is a part of life and a part of culture. And no, you should not be letting your kid watch, porn and things like this. Something's wrong with you. You have a problem entirely if that's what we're talking about. But we're talking about a book that may have one kid character that happens to express an interest in the same sex, and all of a sudden it's not age appropriate. Meanwhile, that same child is probably reading the Sweet Valley Twins or any sort of book that's like that, where they're always chasing some boy or something. So what's your point? That's really my retort. I don't have any respect for people who say things like that, because it's so profoundly out of sync with reality, and they have to know how much it's a bad faith argument. They have to.
And then it's the counter argument that that one should make, whether they're part of the LGBT plus community, or just or something like like me, like an ally, like a solidarity ally. Should we also counter and say, well, look, we live in an institutional heteronormative world, which marginalizes gays, lesbians, bisexual, trans, and other queer folk. And isn't it time that we start teaching kids at an early age that it's okay to be a non-straight person, rather than every LGBT plus person who goes through the phase in life where they're made fun of as little kids, like you're so gay, then bullied as teenagers, marginalized in high school, and then maybe by the time they're in college, if they find like a good if they find a community that's that is all bisexual pride or queer pride and whatnot, then they're going to be okay. But until then, and if they don't even find that in whatever college they go to, then they're either living in the closet, or they live very, very miserable lives, which results in the tragic epidemics of suicide or unhappy marriages, which later fall apart because they came out too late.
Substance use disorders and all kinds of things, right? Yeah, of course we should be educating children earlier on about, that there's a spectrum of sexuality and a spectrum of genders. Of course we should be educating children earlier on, because why should we have to always see the same coming of age story, the same semi-tragic coming of age story? We don't always see that with heterosexual children. Why should non-heterosexual children have to always suffer in order to be, I don't know, worthy eventually? It just doesn't, I don't understand why you put a child through that kind of, psychological torment when you don't have to. To just sit there and presume that your child is just going to be straight if I don't teach them these things, it's just so odd. Because if that was the case, we never would have had queer people at all. There's a whole part of, like, at least in recent history, the whole segment of recent history, European post-colonialism history, where good luck finding some gay material, It took a while for Oscar Wilde and whatnot to come along. Good luck finding some gay material. So tell me how these queer people came out of nowhere, though. If they were just sitting around reading the Bible and reading all this straight material, and yet somehow they still managed to be queer. So clearly not teaching them is not going to not make them gay or not make them queer. So what is to be lost by just literally teaching them and letting them understand, hey, this is what the world is. This is actually the diversity of the world that you're going to be entering into. And I think it just helps kids be more confident so that they're not vulnerable to predators down the road too. It's just very important for your kids' overall psychological health to help them understand the kind of diverse world they're going to be going into.
But the fact that it seems, every, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, it seems as if every time, a small gains are made for the community, whether it's marriage equality or the fact, whether it's marriage equality, whether it's, trans people allowed to serve in the military, or the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or or people are simply just much more tolerant in their attitudes, that Prop 8 in California got repealed. But the fact that there's always that's always followed by immediately another round of backlashes, right-wing regressive backlashes. Does that mean that this is why we need to have more more queer centers, more queer centers where if where if gay youth are going to be engaging in sex and stuff like that, or trans people need, or again, trans people need that safe space. This is why we need those queer organizations, why we need those centers, because if the school is not going to teach them safe safe sex because because of their heteronormative attitudes, or because, well, I completely forgot that about that. This is why we do, this is why we do need these queer organizations to exist to.
Yeah. It's absolutely why we need more. There's always going to be blowback. Whenever there's progress, blowback is always huge. It's that whole, you take one step forward and there's always 3, 4, 5 steps back. And we've seen it on the racial side of things, and we see it on the queer side of things as well. And the only thing that helps sort of stand in the way of those forces that are aligned against us, completely throwing us back into the dark ages, are organizations and major movements, really. But I also say media as well. It's amazing how much we can underestimate just the sheer value of media to counter some of the blowback, right? But it is exactly why we need more of those organizations. And it's why we need the existing queer organizations to be as inclusive as possible, really. And making sure that they, in any programming that they have, any sort of work that they do, that they are giving equal weight to some extent to all the different groups, and being able to actually react when necessary to moments when certain groups within our community are under attack more. So ideally, an organization should be able to give equal weight to every, group within the queer community, but be able to shift when needed to focus more of their attention on the trans community when they're more so under attack, or to focus their attention on, this part of the community when they're more under attack. You have to be flexible and nimble in terms of countering these, hostile ideologues. You have to be very nimble and flexible because they're always ready. Our counterparts are always ready.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not because
yeah, some of our exactly, maybe because you have so many people who are for the L, maybe the B, but certainly the L, certainly the L and the G, maybe a little bit of the B, but there's certainly there's certainly like very trans, very transphobic. It's, and like the U.S., it's hilarious how it's like, oh yeah, like the right wing are now much more tolerant towards towards gays and lesbians, hence why they need a new they need a new person to like beat the shit out of
exactly
trans people.
Exactly. There's always got to be some villain, right? In their mind, but they're nimble. Our counterparts are very flexible, and it's not because they're smarter. I think sometimes we overestimate the intelligence of the opposition, and really the opposition are just very opportunistic. Right-wing movements are extremely opportunistic. They're not smarter. They're just ready for the opportunities. They're always ready. The other side, the left-wing, folks are just never quite as ready. And I think that's for a very, specific set of reasons. One of the reasons is that on the left-wing side of things, we value a diversity of opinions. We generally value a democratic model of getting things done. And a democratic model of getting things done can be kind of slow compared to a more authoritarian type of way of getting things done on the right-wing side of things.
Interesting.
So, there are reasons why we're never fully prepared in some ways, or we just don't react as quickly as we should. I think sometimes though, we have to realize expedience is important and put aside some differences and be like, okay, this is our single-minded mission for now. For now, this is our single mind. We still have our general principles that we all agree upon, right? We have that meeting of the minds, but now we got to set aside any kind of little differences we have about how to get there and tackle this one thing, because this thing could blow it all up for us if we don't. But we don't really know how to do that on the left side of things, whether it's the queer community or otherwise. We don't know how to do that because we want to make sure everyone's heard and valued by his opinion. And it's like, that's true. But sometimes situations are very urgent and we don't have time for safe spaces and things, because it's going to all be very not safe very soon if we don't react. So yeah,
that's that's a perfect segue to this question that I wanted to ask, which is, what do you think of the whole identity politics versus the class struggle debate? Do you think it's an unnecessary debate? And how would you kill 2 or 3 injustices with one stone or sword or a gun? And how would you advise the hardline class first folk, some of our white cis male Marxists and and whatnots, that this is how we chew gum and walk at the same time?
Exactly. We can chew gum and walk at the same time. We actually are capable of having multiple thoughts at one time because evolution. But the way I would respond to that, identity politics versus class struggle, first of all, I really feel that whenever I see that dichotomy come up, whenever I see people turn that into dichotomy, it's almost always white leftist. It's almost always white leftist. Because I feel that if you are non-white in this country, you automatically understand how your identity, your racial identity, your queer, your sexual identity, and all these things, how they are completely interconnected with your class identity. You can't separate them, right? But it always seems that cis, straight, white folks on the left we need to, set aside identity politics. And my response is, I think what you mean are representational politics or representation politics. I think what you mean is you have a problem with folks feeling like this one face in a position of power is good enough. That's not actually what identity politics is about. And I always point people to the Combahee River Collective statement where the term identity politics got coined. And they talk about the incredible need for understanding that politics has to take into consideration the way that our identity determines where we are and where we will go in this country, and all the barriers that we're up against. We have to have an awareness of how our identities interact. I don't like to say intersect, how they interact, how they inform each other to position us in a certain way in this country, and how it actually impacts the way that our class identity is going to feel. So my working class, I come from a working class background as a Black woman. It's very different than coming from a working class identity if I was a white woman. I have friends who are white from working class backgrounds, and they sound positively middle class to me in terms of the way they describe their upbringing. I was like, so your dad owned his own business? Wow. That's not my working class background at all. So you guys you never felt like you were gonna, like the lights got cut off or nothing like that? Nope. And so you eventually, got your own business because you just learned the ropes from your dad, and he was like, hey, you're gonna learn how to handle your own business and run a business yourself. It's like, wow, sounds middle class to me. But that's that particular friend of mine, that's her working class background. And she is a working class white woman. She married an upper middle class white man, and his background is very different than hers. So I totally get in her mind why she's working class and he is upper middle class, but she sounded completely middle class to me as a Black person from a working class background. So we have to understand the way our identities inform our class movement in this country if we're even going to begin to tackle class issues in the first place, which is also why I don't think white people can be allowed to lead any class struggle in this country. But that's my little opinion there.
Well, I have to ask a follow-up then to that one. And do you think that's because that even the white Marxists, the fact that they say that we need to set aside identity politics. It's class which which unites us all, and the moment we get rid of institutional classism, all the other evils will be eviscerated. That itself is white privilege because yes, you get to make the rules like that because you are a white person. But what about the patriarchy?
Yeah.
What about the fact that are you ready then to say that are you ready then to say that, hey, we need to make sure that like our trans people are represented, and if somebody's being discriminated on a job because they are gay, bisexual, and whatnot, what are you guys going to do about that? And I do understand where a lot of white leftists come from when they say that class is the big issue. I know completely where they're coming from, and there is some truth that once you deal with the class issue, it is like killing several birds with one stone. But at the same time, knowing the history of the United States, Britain, and Australia, Black people, Indigenous people, and so forth have always been excluded every time the workers' movement has made gain. Women have been excluded from those gains, and if women were included, of course, it was white women that were included, but never Black women, Indigenous women, Latinos.
And all you have to do is look at the history of labor and union organizing in this country to understand that you cannot assume that white working class and Black working class is just going to somehow come together by virtue of being working class. Like the history is there to show that that's not how it works. It's not how it's going to happen. MLK was fixated towards the end of his life on addressing class and how it intersects and interacts with race, how it interacts with our international posturing. He was fixated on understanding how all of that works together. And I like how sometimes some of these leftists, they will parse out little bits of MLK or Fred Hampton to be like, oh, they were just focused on class struggle and they understood we need to unite the white working class. And I was like, no, both of those men fully understood not just how class struggle is important, but how it completely works in tandem with racism, with our international foreign policy, and with sexism to some extent as we got further on, and men like Baldwin came into the picture and talked more about those things. But so this parsing it out, and it's easy for white folks to say, oh, just class, because they go through society, through life, having in their minds the default racial identity. So for them, it's not like they have a racial identity. It's not like they have any other identity really besides whatever class and gender they come from, right? And so it's very easy for a white man in particular to be like, oh, it's just class. But it's like, well, that's because that's the only thing that really affects you directly as a white man. But talk to one of your white women friends and ask her how much gender affects her. Talk to one of your white women friends who's a lesbian, ask her how much gender and sexuality affects her. And then start talking to some of your people of color friends, okay? If you have any. So you can't separate them. You really, really can't separate them. I've had people ask me weird questions like, what do you think has made your life harder? Being a woman or being Black or being from the working class? And I was like, all of them? Like, I
all the above.
I cannot separate them. I can't say that if I stripped away one, everything would have just been so much better. I have friends, Black women friends who are from middle class backgrounds. They struggle as much as I do.
Yeah.
And I came from staunchly, one of my best friends comes from a staunchly middle class background. And she struggles as much as I do. So clearly stripping away the working class component isn't going to make that much of a difference because I'm still Black and woman. So if I take Black away, sure, okay, some things will be better, but I'm still a woman and I'm still queer. So, so I just think it's very important to never try to separate them, because the powers that be don't separate them. I really am a firm believer that the opposition really grasps and understands the nuances and the complexities, and they play on them to keep us divided. But that doesn't mean we should just go along with them, what they're trying to convince us of, and ignore the complexities. They want us to do that. They want us to ignore the complexities. But we have to acknowledge it. We just have to get away from representation kind of like politics.
Exactly.
Like, this one person who's queer in a position of power is gonna, that's all we need. We got to get away from that, because that's not identity politics. That's just shallow representation. That's not identity politics. But identity politics is one of those words, like one of those terms like critical race theory. It has just a sound to it that people can latch onto if they want to hate something.
Or wokeism, when some douchebag like Hillary Clinton is talking about like, we need to be all woke. Yeah, of course, I reject her. I reject her identity politics because it's shallow. It conserves, it conserves, capitalism. Her agenda is not my agenda. So yeah, I can understand why people want to reject shallow people like like the Hillary Clintons of the world, the Obamas of the world. But nowadays when I hear people complain about wokeism, it's so obvious, like they're engaging in such a dog whistle of I don't want to talk about institutional racism, I don't want to talk about anti-Black racism, and you only have to look at the kind of supposedly leftists who are complaining about wokeism in Britain to know that like they don't want to talk about about the fact that there is anti-Black racism, and there's xenophobia and transphobia and whatnot in that country, and it's not social justice warriors, it's not some liberal academic, which is the reason why you guys haven't been able to achieve some kind of a left-wing revolution. It's it's a lot of things, but it's 99 problems, but us people of color aren't one of them.
Ain't that the truth? Ain't that the truth? Well, it's just, I think there's so much that can be, your eyes can be opened so much too, just by listening and learning about those connections between all these different identities. In my work, I do policy work, and I didn't realize how much some of my colleagues did not understand that these racial disparities and who holds medical debt, for instance, are not just coincidental disparities that just kind of like, oh yeah, there's racism, so that these disparities happen. It's like, no, there are like direct lines we can draw to the past to show you exactly why these disparities exist. And I wrote a report recently, and I spent time in that report talking about Jim Crow segregation in hospitals and how that is directly tied to the current disparities we see in health conditions and also in who holds medical debt, and where hospitals actually are more willing to help Black patients afford care. It's completely connected. In the Jim Crow hospitals, or hospital segregation was huge all over the country. But in the South, we saw a situation where there just weren't hospitals that Black people could go to, right? In the North, there was just separate hospitals they sent them to that were kind of inferior, right?
Yeah.
South, they just didn't exist. And what we see currently in today, right now, is that the areas of the country where the most medical debt exists and where chronic conditions are the worst is exactly those Jim Crow Southern states and those major cities where lots of Black people were clustered up north that experienced Jim Crow segregation in hospitals in their own way. So you can't really disconnect these historical legacies of racism, of homophobia, of all these things from the present conditions. There's almost always a direct line. And I think part of the reason there's this impulse among people to constantly separate identity politics and class struggle is like, I think it comes from this weird amnesia that Americans have about the past. And this inability for Americans, I think, to really understand that the past is always present. I think if we had a recognition that the past is always present, we would never make some of the arguments we make about ignoring identity. We would never make some of these arguments. We would understand that everything that gay folks went through in the 80s, that has a direct impact currently. There's a reason why there's a certain age group of gay men that have hardly no other friends in their age, because they watched all their friends die, in the epidemic of AIDS. So that stuff is very present. It never is over. So I'm always adamant to help people see that they're not mad about identity politics. They're mad about shallow representation, because identity politics is crucial to solving any of these problems. And class struggle is an identity politics. Class is an identity. It is part of identity politics. So
yeah, and it's funny, you were talking about how sometimes the queer community, while you're saying that while gays and lesbians have it hard, and of course bisexual folk, but that we shouldn't, but that sometimes there does come a time where we need to recognize the advances that are made and highly focus on those who are really getting the shit kicked out of them. So the plight of trans people. So that being said, I have to then ask this question, which is, what's it going to take in the United States for the left community that we identify with to focus on the plight, the criminally overlooked plight of our indigenous brothers and sisters, because I was saying to a past guest, Elaine, I was saying to her that, like, if America was a caste system, the Native Americans would basically be the Dalits, and while I do recognize that things are not hunky dory for Black people, but still, like, our plight is like a 5-star hotel compared to the plight of Native Americans. So what's going to take for and then another example is there's lots of talks about anti imperialism, and I find like the Palestine justice movement gets a lot has like a good solid base in the United States. You can get millions to march against the Iraq war and to say no to NATO. But again, the plight of Native Americans, it's criminally overlooked, and it's criminally, not even a topic which even the best left-wing news outlets talk about. So what's going to take for the urgent human rights issues of Native Americans to be addressed?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. I think it might be a great question to end on too. I have to eat dinner shortly.
No problem.
But it's a great question because when I was in law school, I had to do some research on adoption and kids in the foster system. And the stunning kinds of stats that I found about the sheer percentage of Native American children in the foster system in certain states, even though their actual like population size in the state was minimal, they'd be like 80% of the foster system, was truly unnerving. And the fascinating thing, in addition to that, is that whenever I saw like a very unnerving stat about Native American children in the foster system, the one group that was right there behind, like right there next to them, just one little notch up, would be Black folks. And so like, we're really neck and neck in terms of stats. Like, if you look for any stat about who's the most in prison, who's this, that, and you're looking for a horrible, sad stat, it's almost a guarantee that Native Americans will be the worst impacted, and then Black folks. It's like, it's always right there. It's right there. And so I don't know why we've hit a point where we just kind of feel like, it's not worth addressing their issues or something. Honestly, I think there's a great invisibility around Native American issues because some people just feel like they don't exist anymore, like that the white folks were successful. I think the biggest hurdle that community is going to have in terms of fighting, for their rights is helping people realize that they still fucking exist. So many people just don't seem to realize that they still exist. I always think of that one Chris Rock joke that, funny enough.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, from Bigger and Blacker. Yes.
Yeah. I'm like, it's funny enough, but it's wrong too about, the Native American Day parade or something like that. And he was like, because they killed them all. I was like, well, not actually. But how many of us actually know that? Because they're so segregated though, in a lot of ways. Reservations have really done a good job in making it seem like they don't exist to the wider public. They're so segregated. I was grown before I met a person who was from an indigenous background who was like, yeah, I'm from this particular group. I was grown. I was at the laundromat in Iowa. And it was this indigenous guy that started talking to me. And I don't know, I think I thought he was like Latino or something, because I think that's the default. And then he mentioned what group he belonged to. I can't even remember, but it was an Iowa group. And I was like, oh, interesting. And we just started talking. And then later on in my career, working in the environmental space, because they are heavily involved in the environmental space. They're very important in the environmental community because essentially indigenous folks and Black folks spearheaded the environmental movement back in, ages ago. But once I got into that work, I started meeting more indigenous folks from out Southwest, folks from Maryland, just various indigenous groups. So it's hard to fault people for thinking that they don't really exist, because how many of us actually meet indigenous people that we know of because of the segregation that has been forced on them.
So we need two campaigns. We need a we exist campaign for the bisexual folk, and a we exist campaign for the indigenous brothers and sisters.
We need some up-to-date current movies and whatnot that really prominently feature indigenous folks. That's what we need. And I think we're getting that. There's one show that I haven't watched yet that people have mentioned. I can't remember what it's called though. But yeah, visibility is so key to power. I really will say, I think that needs to be emphasized, that visibility is key to power. And without it, you're just stumbling in the dark. You are stumbling in the dark. And folks are not even going to realize you're stumbling there because they don't even know you're there.
And just before I let you go to your dinner, so we're not going to have time to talk about your books, but the next time I have you on, and I definitely want to have you on as a regular, we're going to definitely talk about we're definitely going to talk about your books, and you're going to say to me, which ones you recommend people get, which are your top 3 or top 5. But before I let you go, I have to, we usually end the program now with the questionnaire done by Marcel Proust, later Bernard Pivot, and then done by my hero, the late James Lipton of Inside the Actor Studio. So, okay. Berneta, what is your favorite words?
Oh, my favorite words. Oh,
Word,
goodness.
just one word. It does have to
I
be.
mean, I'm overly obsessed a little bit with the word diabolical nowadays. I just think it rolls off the tongue well. I don't know. And some people are so horrible, or some things are so horrible that diabolical just feels right. It's like the hard consonant sounds of it. Yeah, that's a word I like.
What's your least favorite word?
My least favorite word. Ugh. Oh, that's a tough one. My least favorite word. This is gonna sound weird. Intersectionality.
Okay, no problem.
It has been co-opted and it basically has been boiled down to mean almost nothing. So I avoid using it.
And what sound or noise do you love?
Noise. What kind of noise or sound do I like?
Yeah.
I used to be terrified of it as a kid, but I love the sound of like thunder and rain. It's very calming. It's as long as I'm not under a big tree, and I live under a big one, so it's a little less calming. But for the most part, it's very calming. I just feel like I want to read or write or something.
And what sound or noise do you hate?
What sounded vocal frying. I really cannot stand
vocal frying.
Oh yeah. It's when people talk like they have a lot to say, but they don't really know how to say it. It's that kind of way of talking. It's the Kim K way of talking. Oh man, it bugs me.
And what's your what's your favorite curse word?
Favorite curse word. Oh, this is one I picked up from London. I picked up several from London actually, but fucking hell always just sticks with me. Something about the combination. Yeah, fucking hell. That's a good one.
And what turns you on spiritually, emotionally, or creatively?
Critical thinking. I know that sounds dorky and goofy, but people who can like just take apart something and really see beyond just the thing itself, that is so amazing to me. And it just makes me feel like I'll just sit there and listen to them talk for as long as they want.
And then what turns you off?
The lack thereof. Folks who really just read, they spout out whatever they saw on TV. They don't think about it at all. Passive consumption is what really turns me off. I'll put it that way, passive consumption.
Cough, cough, people who are gung-ho for NATO and war in Ukraine. And then what profession would you love to do if you weren't doing what you're doing now?
Yeah, so I work in policy advocacy now, and of course I write books, novels. But if I wasn't doing that, I always thought the idea of having like a rescue farm where I rescue all these like dogs would be like my, that'd be my alternate self. I'd get my Caesar Milan on, essentially.
And what profession would you absolutely not like to do under any circumstances?
Oh, I could never do anything in the medical field that requires cutting and all that. I don't have the hand for it. I would be terrified that I'm going to completely pop a vein and somebody's going to die on my table. And plus, I would probably vomit just from the smell of the blood.
Yeah. So. And then final question. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the Pearlia gates, or whatever is your, vision of the afterlife?
Yeah. That's a funny one. As an atheist, this is a funny one. So what would I like him to say? I think I would like, or her to say, I think I would like God to say, you did everything you wanted to do, right? Like, I think that's the question that I want. I want a question, so I have time to answer it, and maybe put God on blast for why I didn't get to do all the things I wanted to do, and that you should be ashamed of yourself creating this paradigm that didn't allow me to do all the things I wanted to do. That's my answer to that one.
Well, I'm sure. Well, hopefully, hopefully he/she or they will be able to take those criticisms, and yeah, hopefully they'll be able to take those criticisms and say, well, I can put you in purgatory, and then we can have a very long discussion. Or anywho. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with the fantastic Berneta L. Haynes, who is, as she says, she's, she works in policy by day, but she's a novelist by night. Berneta, thank you so much for coming on the program to talk about to talk about bisexual folk and biphobia. I hope to have you back on as a regular. Definitely will have you back on, during that month of, Bi Pride to talk more about that issues. But I definitely want to have you back on again, also to talk about your novels and what pisses us off and why the left should be listening to our advice.
Oh, I'm game. I'm game. I look forward to joining you again. This was a fabulous conversation. I could talk all day about some of this stuff. And I'm really appreciative that you had me on.
Likewise. And you have a fantastic dinner, and we will be in touch, all right?
All right. Bye now.